Hey gang, it's KR King of D&D Homebrew talking today about the mechanics of the short and long rest in 5e. But also you could extend this conversation in a system agnostic way to other systems. I'm just going to use that as a template. But it's always thinking about where your players are when, they've taken a bunch of hit points or they've used up their spells and they want to rest overnight to regain hit points, whatever system they're in, regain their spells so that they can continue to function in the world at an optimal level. And the way you want to think about it as a GM. And I'm going to use the 5e example because a lot of times people complain, especially if you've played older systems, about the whole rest for 6 hours and get back all your hit points and all your spells. And the all your hit points thing just seems unrealistic when we think about, taking sword hits or claws or bites or whatever. Really, I rest overnight and they're all gone. It doesn't make sense. It's clearly a game mechanic. And the older systems that I was familiar with, because, when I came into 5e and you got them all back, this was a little bit of a shocker to me as well. And the idea here is to think about whichever ones you're using and what the ramifications are for your players traveling through your world, whether it's out in the wilderness and they're getting into encounters and they're using spells, or down in a dungeon, they're in some mega dungeon that takes a super long time to get down and they've got to rest. What does that mean? Because oftentimes we think of the long and short rest mechanics in 5e and in 4e, when people that played that, as, oh, wow, this gives the players way too much. In my day, it was 1 point a day, all that kind of stuff. But, you can have fun with the players being able to get those spells back and using the short rest. It's just another mechanic that has to be thought through. But what you want to do is think about how you're going to arrange things in your world, different areas that are more dangerous or different numbers of encounters, and thinking about the way the rules work such that it doesn't unbalance your game. In the old days of the original D&D, let's start with first edition, you got 1 point a day. And then if you rested for 30 days solid, then I think you got 8 a day or something. But basically you had to get healing spells or potions or something if you weren't going to just rest for days on end after a major battle. And then this changed in third edition, where you got your level of hit points back. Your 5th level, you get 5 points per night of rest. 10th level, 10 points, that sort of thing. And this was, we were appreciative of this. But the third edition rules also, as I remember, made getting healing potions and things much easier. So there were more people with healing spells. So it wasn't quite as deadly as in the first and second editions. And of course, it was 4th edition which introduced the concept that you got your hit points and your healing surges back after a 6-hour rest. And a lot of people complained about this. They said this is the video gameization of D&D. Certainly was a lot different than third, and which was different than the other ones, although only marginally. So this was a radical change, right? Now, what was interesting about the 4th edition rules was you had to do a 6-hour rest, sleep, low activities. If you were interrupted, let's say you had to march somewhere for 2 hours, you added that on to the remaining time. So after that 2 hours, instead of having 3 left, you had 5 left. So there were some changes in terms of 5e. Obviously, the introduction of the short rest, a 1-hour rest that you can do any number of times per day. And then the long rest has some slight differences as well. The short rest, you don't get your spells back, but you get certain abilities like key points for the monk or bardic inspiration, and there's other ones you can get. And then you can roll up to however many hit dice. Your 5th level, you can roll up to 5 hit dice. Your die, let's say you have 8-sided die, you can roll that and get those points back. But you can only regenerate once you use up your hit dice. You must have a long rest in order to get those back. And then the long rest, of course, you must rest for 6 hours uninterrupted. And if there's a battle that takes 3 minutes, you got to start again. You don't just add those 3 minutes on like you did in 4th edition. You've got to start again. And importantly, you can only have a long rest every 24 hours. One long rest, right? So the thing is, you get up in the morning, I guess you say you start your 6 hours, let's say you started at midnight, and you get up at 6 a.m. And you go marching and you have a couple battles. And you take a short rest, and then you have another battle, let's just say. And now the spells are gone, and the other characters are, they don't have very many hit points. What are you going to do? You cannot take a long rest. You've got to wait. So do you just hide somewhere and hang out? And the thing about this, you as a GM, if they're saying, well, we don't want to keep going, we want to hide somewhere. They're out in the middle of the wilderness. And we'll get to dungeons in a second here. Well, do you roll random monsters? Do they continue to peck away at the players when they're not getting their long rest? They have a battle. They got to start 6 hours. They got to, basically they're going to wait till the end of the day for their 24 hours. So that comes into the nighttime. But during the day, do they have random encounters? And then at night, if they're sleeping out in the wilderness, can they be interrupted? Again, do you roll for random monsters, or, you just have a standard thing, however you do it in your world? So one of the things people will talk about is the 5e buff of Liam's tiny hut. If you look at earlier editions, it just provided basically a shelter from the elements, like if you're in an Arctic environment or something. But you could missile fire, spells, whatnot. Weapons could penetrate it. And now it provides this total protection. This renders the long rest. You just create, it's a ritual spell, so it doesn't cost any spell slots. You could just cast it over and over and be safe. And technically this is true, except one, you got to have a bard or a wizard in the party. I'm running a group right now. They don't have one. They're 6th level. They don't have that spell. Are they necessarily going to force people to be character classes they don't necessarily want to be? Then they got to learn this spell. You got to have it. So when you get to 5th level, is that one of the spells you want to take to learn when there's some other good ones on the spell list? And the other element, of course, it can be dispelled pretty easily. Now, people say, well, how often do you run into monsters or NPCs that have a dispel magic on them? Well, there are monsters with spells. Let's say you have a Hag's Coven, right? And you look at their spell list, you say, well, there's no dispel magic on there. Well, why not? They're incredibly protective of their territory. And if they're living in the world and they see people out there, with Liam's tiny hut just staying on their territory, and they're, maybe they're going to set up an ambush, which is what things could do. They recognize this hut, and they know people are in there, and they set up an ambush. It attracts things that wait. But the hags might decide, I'm going to learn dispel magic, right? It's not that mysterious. How do they get their spells? So things could learn dispel magic. Again, you're not necessarily getting into a situation where, you're going to use Liam's tiny hut, then all my monsters have innate dispel magic. You're not doing that. You're not trying to beat the players. But you're also trying to say, this world is a dangerous place. There are things in there. And the 24-hour game mechanic of getting back your spells after, the long rest, we're going to think about the ramifications for that. So if they've got Liam's tiny hut, again, I know people that just say, I don't use that spell, literally. And you can find Reddit forums and discussions on this. I say just think about how would things react that don't want things on their territory or are hunting for things when characters use Liam's tiny hut. And then after the long rest, they only get half of the dice back that they used on short rest the day before. So you can't just keep using this. You're going to run out of hit dice, and then now that goes away, and you get a half again. And again, you're always going to only have that half until you've had 2 long rests. And the thing to think about is if in your world you've got time-sensitive stuff, again, this is why it's so important to track time, as I said in an earlier video. If they're in a hurry to get somewhere and they run into some encounters or something happens or they have to use a bunch of spells and they want to always have their spells, they're going to have to sit there all day and then rest overnight because they only get a long rest every 24 hours. And things are happening. There's a clock ticking. This is one of the pressures on players to do this. They've got to travel someplace very quickly. They don't want to have these encounters. And the other thing about this is if you go into a dangerous area where there are potentially lots of encounters, or at least the encounters there are going to be deadly, they're going to force the players to use spells and to risk losing hit points, they're going to realize that this, you better be prepared for this. You better, if you have abilities to get healing potions, just, stock up on them, to find areas here that you can hide and whatnot. So that the mechanic isn't so much this video gamey thing of, all I got to do is just sit still for 6 hours. I get all my hit points, all my spells back. Again, there are limitations set on this. There are conditions. You're going to run out of hit points in terms of short rests if you can take them. And certainly that 24-hour rule makes, travel potentially really slow and potentially very dangerous. Then you get into dungeons, right? Players run out of spells or get low on hit points delving into some dungeon. And their impulse is to just find a room to hide in and to literally sit there. It might, again, be noon. They're going to sit there until 6 of the next morning or whenever they got up, however you had that. So you have to decide as the GM, well, do things come around and hunt for these rooms? And again, they've locked themselves in this room. Probably it's going to be okay. Are there going to be things waiting outside, sniffing around? Do they detect them? What's this dungeon like? Is it empty? Because again, if you're caving, right? Cavers always go in to a certain length, and they very rarely want to stay in there overnight. It's exhausting. They're cold, wet. They don't bring a lot of gear unless it's part of the thing. They're going super deep into some advanced cave, but typically they go in and they come back out, and that might be the way players do it. Because one of the things is you can say that when the players have investigated an area in a dungeon, they can move pretty quickly through it without worrying, whereas when they're moving through, checking for traps or, watching for things, they're going to be moving much more slowly. I know the movement rates don't reflect that, but you can say that in terms of them leaving or coming back. Or you can just say, hey, if you want to go deep into this dungeon, if you've got some multi-layer mega dungeon, you're going to have to figure out a way to rest. And then you as the GM, are there things that go around and literally hunt for things that are hanging out in certain rooms? This is why when you make a room with a secret door in it, right, if it stays, when the players shut it from the other side, now it's secret, that's a safe place. And you might want to put these strategically. If you've got a mega dungeon, the players find them and they realize, hey, we can take a long or short rest here. But you may not have one. You may have a dungeon in which the doors are flimsy or no doors at all, or one section where you've got to make your run across that section, because if you're going to take a long rest and there are going to be, wandering monsters coming around, they're going to be constantly interrupted, right? And as I say, this is like another feature of this place. It's just like terrain or, a deadly area filled with monsters, such that you're taking what the long and short rest mechanics are and thinking about what would be areas where it's difficult to do that. What would be areas where there's just too much stuff there, or there's no safe place there for the players to just be able to rest for 6 hours uninterrupted, right? They're going to have watches and things. And this was something that we did, starting from the very beginnings of D&D when we only got one back. But what we were trying to do was get enough heal spells. Again, way back when, you didn't have that many spells, right? So we would literally find places to just hide out for days on end. And was that realistic? I mean, I don't know. What it did was it made time-sensitive things extra deadly, because now you were going against the clock. Now you're running across the wilderness as fast as you can, knowing, because I got to get to someplace in 3 days, because the opposing group is coming from some other direction, or some monster's going to go and kill someone. Whatever the reason is, I've got to find this artifact and then bring it over to here. And I know I'm not going to have time to spend weeks on end resting. So now it's reduced in D&D with the 24-hour long rest mechanic, but it's not reduced completely. Because, again, I'm not the one. I know they say 6 to 8 encounters. I'm not going to have 6 to 8 encounters. It just, I don't know. It's a lot of die rolling, a lot of, initiative and battles and stuff. That becomes your whole thing. But certainly one big one or two big ones in a day, and you might use up a lot of your spells, right? And certainly hit points. And now, again, when you look at the clerics, some of the life cleric especially, but even the light cleric, some of these clerics have, when they get up there, have just massive healing abilities. So you say, well, then if I don't want to run 3 or 4 battles a day, so I guess, the long resting doesn't come into account as much. Well, think about that. Think about ways if you start to have conditions, players are poisoned, they're frightened, they're paralyzed, whatever it is, and then those conditions affect their battle capabilities, and suddenly things become much nastier and do damage. Or you have something like trolls or something, again, just higher level monsters that do a lot of damage. Think about that in terms of how are they going to rest up for this? Because once the clerics have used all those fancy healing abilities, they're gone. They don't have them, right? Because once those things are gone, and once they've used up their short rest hit points, what are they going to do? And they've no more heal potions, right? And again, shouldn't be everywhere, but you're just taking the mechanics of the long and short rest, but you're not having to have, like in the old days where you'd go out in the wilderness and we had to literally find a place and just sit for a week. I mean, you'd sit for 2 or 3 days because you had enough heals once you got up levels, but you know what I'm saying? It wasn't just overnight. You had to use those spells to cure up. Well, we don't have that anymore, which means we can do things more quickly, but that doesn't mean you as a GM can't set up stuff that drains a lot of hit points or has an area where they're not going to get a long rest. There's just too many wandering monsters. There's too much going on. And this might be a swamp hex where things are just moving through here, hunting all the time. Mountain hex, again, why would mountains be that way? Well, there's things that fly around at night or something and are constantly searching, and they have infravision or whatever, dark vision. Think about that. Create areas where the players know, hey, you don't just get the long rest mechanic here. Because I do think in the long run, it doesn't bother me that much, the long and short rest mechanics. And I know there's people out here that they hate the cantrips. You know who you are. It doesn't bug me that much. But it definitely means you as a GM have to think about what does that mean for the players to have a short and long rest. And that is the long and short of that topic. And if you like what you've seen on my channel, please subscribe. I'm always looking for more. Leave some comments. Tell me what you think of the long and short rest mechanics, what you think of the older ones, especially if you're running an older system or a different system from the D&D world, and how that works in your world. And most importantly, my friends, keep playing an RPG game of whatever kind you prefer and tell somebody else about it.